Bishop, Principal, Dean, Bishop, faculty. This is a terrific thrill and honor for me to receive this degree and to be invited to this distinguished lectureship. It's the sort of thing you hope for, but you can't really ask for. So this sort of thing comes, as they say in the South, it's like grits, it just comes. The Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is an indispensable text for the synagogue and the church, and it is yet a defining text for our culture. It is variously indispensable and defining because it mediates and attests the character of a God who is capable of a mercy, justice, and faithfulness that issues in forgiveness, generosity, and hospitality. With its collage of stories, songs, and oracles, it reminds us always again that our world is more than the sum of our efforts, possessions, and commodities, conveying to us a sense of wonder and awe and mystery that elude our explanations and show up in concrete existence. It is indeed a book of wonder. It is at the same time a huge vexation. Any attentive reader of the Old Testament will notice that the character of God in this text is less than attractive, is prone to violence that issues in retaliation. The world that clusters around this problematic character is a world that is expressed in rhetoric that defies our conventional ways of speaking, filled as it is with disjunction, hyperbole, and contradiction. The match between the content and the way of articulation means that this text defies both the settled orthodoxy of the church and the smooth explanatory reason of the Enlightenment. We are, as a result, on notice when we enter its pages that we have access to a strange world of imagination. It is this odd combination of wonder and vexation that continues to summon us to this text. In what follows, I will explore that interface of wonder and vexation and try to show why this text matters to us. I will do so under the rubric of certitude and fidelity, or more precisely, a practice of fidelity in a world of certitude. The gods of certitude are as old as Near Eastern religion. They are constituted by what Morton Smith called common theology. These gods are regularly allied with dominant power. They mete out rewards and punishments, blessings and curses. They rule with clarity about requirements and reliabilities. They know what is right and what is wrong, and they guarantee connections between actions and outcomes. This world of the gods of certitude is a world of no forgiveness and eventually no grace. It turns out that the gods of certitude are an essential basis for empire. Empires characteristically appeal to such certitudes as warrants for political power that is placed beyond criticism. Thus, the great myths of certitude are characteristically hosted in the great liturgies of state and party, so that a necessary linkage is made between godly purpose and political power. That certitude that provides a basis for empire also provides a basis for religious orthodoxy, because orthodoxy tends to be a formulation of truth that intends to silence all alternatives as false and impossible. Thus is born an alliance between power and truth. That twinned package of certitudes that takes theological, liturgical form and that takes political, economic form runs from the ancient imperial categories to modern Enlightenment rationality. The Old Testament maintains a steady critique of such gods, even though here and there these gods make an appearance and pretend to be the God of Israel. But these gods of certitude, characteristically in the Old Testament, are treated as idols. So in Psalm 115, their idols are silver and gold. They have mouths, but do not speak, eyes, but do not see, ears, but do not hear, noses, but do not smell, hands, but do not feel, feet that do not walk. And then the next verse says, and those who make them are like them, so are all who trust in them. The long history of imperial religion makes clear that the gods of certitude do not intend transformation. They rather intend to maintain stability and preserve the status quo of theological certitude, political domination, and economic privilege. And I am bound to say in passing that insofar as historical critical study of the Bible is a function of Enlightenment rationality, that historical criticism has also served the gods of certitude in which we have explained away everything that is interesting. In the face of such gods of certitude, the God of the Bible is a God of fidelity who not always, but characteristically refuses certitude. It is that refusal of certitude that constitutes the most interesting and the most difficult interpretive problems for the Bible. That God of certitude, already in the Exodus narrative, challenges the Egyptian gods of certitude and invites Israel to exit the Egyptian domain of certitude that was organized for slavery. This God, who exercises abrasive freedom over the packaged certitudes of Pharaoh, wanted always to initiate and sponsor emancipation from the gods of certitude for the sake of an alternative life. So much later, when David proposes to build a temple for this God says, I don't need a temple because I go to and fro. And later on, when Solomon does build a temple, and in the high liturgy of the temple, Solomon declared that he had built a house in which this God could dwell forever, just a few verses after, some theologian raised the question, will God indeed dwell on earth? Even heaven and the highest heavens cannot contain you, how much less this house that has been built. Such a claim of residence as is made for Solomon's temple, is false because the God who occupies the biblical text is a God of dialogic engagement and relational freedom who will not be boxed in. The God of fidelity wills to be in a bilateral relationship, which means first that God is kept regularly at risk in the relationship, and second, that this God is sometimes prone to infidelity because infidelity is inescapable an option in a relational fidelity that is not and cannot be reduced to certitude. Thus, biblical testimony exhibits a God who is capable of a full range of emotional possibilities that run all the way from self-giving loyalty to self-serving pride and fits of jealous arrogance in the service of self-regard. This kind of a God is contrasted with the gods of certitude who exhibit no emotional depth or complexity. It is this God of fidelity who is able to respond to the deepest yearnings of human existence, but who responds in freedom that is sometimes self-giving and sometimes self-serving. It is, I propose, a primary task of biblical interpretation to sort out the God of fidelity from the gods of certitude, because the gods of certitude always seek to impinge upon the dangerous and often unwelcome freedom of this God of fidelity in order to make this God more palatable, more committed to a settled order, and more amenable to the economic political settlements that we prefer. Because this God is regularly drawn back into the framework of certitude, I will take some time to characterize as best I can the God of fidelity without reference to the pressures of certitude. This character and agent who occupies the biblical text and the imagination of Israel is a God of freedom, who is eager for relational commitments, but who is susceptible to acts of infidelity that jeopardize the relationship. I will identify 3 dimensions of this interpretive tradition that belong to this project with this character in this text. First, concerning the character of the biblical text. The rabbis who received and interpreted the text, as you know, were no champions of certitude. Rather, they found in the biblical text inexhaustible layers of interpretive possibility. And if you've ever seen a classical commentary by the ancient rabbis, you know that it looks like Windows 10, in which you have different texts all over the page. These rabbis articulated interpretive techniques that run from the most literal historical to the most imaginative and the most figurative. This text is open at many levels to fresh disclosure. This menu of interpretive possibilities is echoed in Christian interpretation that moves from the literal to the typological to the allegorical, all of which means that interpretation invites a full play of imagination with the awareness that some meanings are surprisingly given from elsewhere. So the rabbis came to see first that the text is multi-layered, and our feeble 19th century attempt at J, E, D, and P, you know that, was an attempt to talk about multi-layers, albeit in German categories. Second, they understood that the text is multi-voiced. All of the text might be credited to Moses, but Moses can speak in variously in primitive narratives, oracular sermons, songs of lament or victory, priestly passion for precision, royal inventories of extravagance, or sheer poetic playfulness. The traditioning process seems to take no special pains about the relationship of these different genres, so they are abruptly and oddly juxtaposed. Third, the rabbis saw that the presence of many layers of tradition and the sound of many voices means that the text is profoundly complex and cannot be reduced to a smoothness or a certitude. That is why it is possible to find in the Bible almost anything. And when we get raw, rough interfaces that defy our usual reasoning, it means that the text cannot be summarized or reduced to a single account. And fourth, given that the text is multi-voiced, multi-layered, and complex, it does not surprise that the text is deeply conflicted. So does God dwell in the temple or not? When did Israel learn God's name? In Genesis 1 or not until Exodus 6? Is the ground of Sabbath observance creation or Exodus? Is God always present as promised or sometimes absent? The questions are endless. But so it is a zone of fidelity. Fidelity cannot be reduced to certitude. It is rather a process of continual engagement that celebrates the engagement and not some outcome. it is clear enough that such a multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, conflicted text is not amenable to any settled orthodoxy or any legitimated imperial power. Second, Sigmund Freud, great Jew that he was, even though he fought it, took up rabbinic ways of reading the text and used them to understand the human self. So it is easier to see how Jewishness pervaded his work than it is to see how he departed from Jewishness. Indeed, John Murray Cudahy has proposed that Freud's whole theory of repression was the repression of Jews in Western Europe who tried to pass as Gentiles, and that Freudian slips are the popping out of Jewishness at inappropriate times. So Freud did the analysis of the human psyche, thus psychoanalysis, and he exegeted the self in Victorian Vienna that imagined a self that could suppress or conceal or deny all the unwanted aspects of self. So Freud saw that the human self is multi-layered, though so we have depth psychology of what he labeled superego, ego, and id. Second, that Freud saw that the self is multi-voiced, so we imagine that we are integrated selves that speak in one voice, but stuff pops out, at least at night when our guard is down and we dream varied dreams of many voices. Third, Freud understood that the self is endlessly complex, so that when all of these layers surface and all of these voices sound, we do not always know what mode of self will come to voice. And fourth, Freud understood that the self is deeply conflicted, so that psychoanalysis is an attempt to identify and get at the conflict. But of course, that is a very old insight in Jewish tradition that is picked up by Paul in Romans 7. For I do not understand my own actions. I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me? This multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, conflicted self lusts after certitude, a hope that is contrasted to our in-process existence. And what the tradition knows is that the truth of the self is that the self is not able to come to certitude, even though we may be bewitched for a time by the offer of empire or of orthodoxy, with easy answers of certitude in a society that does not want any ambiguity. So text, self, third. If we take seriously the complexity of the text and the truth of the self as multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted, it is in this interpretive tradition a ready move, if not an easy move, to the God of fidelity who occupies the text and the imagination of Israel, whom we Christians dare to say is embodied in Jesus of Nazareth. It is clear from the outset that the God exhibited in the Old Testament is no companion of the gods of Pharaoh or the Empire of Rome. We may moreover conclude that this God is no easy traveling companion of grand Western orthodoxy, as though to become the patron of establishment certitude. So first, the biblical God is multi-layered. Thus, scholars are able, they think, to trace out the God who is primitive and who is developed. And for a long time, we were mesmerized by evolution, J-E-D-N-P. But such forms of supersessionism failed to recognize that all of these layers that attest God are all kept available in the tradition, not scuttled, not superseded, and are available as needed. All of our explanatory markers for decoding this God are futile, because this God continues to occupy the full range of the tradition, even the parts we would not choose. Second, the biblical God is multi-layered, capable of utilizing many genres, capable of priestly liturgy, royal resolve, sapiential shrewdness, architectural plans, the lustful extravagance of lovers, and stories that continue to surprise. These many voicings of God cannot be reduced to the syllogisms of orthodoxy or the assurances of empire, because this God, like a good Jew, always has one more thing to say and finds one more surprising way to say it. Third, the biblical God is stunningly complex and elusive. Just when we arrive at some settled formulation, we get another expose. The God who promised to travel with the slaves from Egypt will not let his face be seen. The God who delivered the ark from the Philistines would not let the ark be touched. The God who is abidingly present turns out to be absent. Thus, Job, on the one hand, can protest the endless surveillance of God, like, quit watching me, but then he can, in the next stanza, say, oh, that I knew where I might find him. Fourth, this God is deeply conflicted as it is given in the text. So in Exodus 34, 6 and 7, that great primal text, God talks about being steadfast and forgiving and all this good stuff. And then it says, yet I will not clear the guilty. Or in Hosea 11, this God rants about recalcitrant Israel, and then in a strange pause, it is as though this God collects God's self and says, how can I do this? How can I give you up? How can I hand you over? How can I make you like Sodom? How can I treat you like... I won't do that, he says, because I am God and not man. And Phyllis Triple says it really means man. Or in Isaiah 54, God concedes, for a brief moment I abandoned you. In overflowing wrath I hid my face from you. But the counter lines have this God say, but with great compassion I will gather you, with everlasting love I will have compassion on you. Or this God can say in Isaiah 42, for a long time I have held my peace, I have kept still, I have restrained myself. But now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and I will pant. So it turns out, I propose, that God is like the text and like the human self. The rabbis found the text to be multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. Freud found the self to be multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. And the biblical tradition attests to us a God who is multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. So when we deal with the God given us here, it is clear that we are remote from the gods of certitude who cannot respond to our deepest yearnings, but who collude to cover up all of the unmanageable forces in our lives. The gods of empire and orthodoxy end in suppression and denial, denying the many layers, silencing the many voices, pretending no complexity, and they ride quickly past the conflicts. But we know better than that. We know that life is indeed multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted, and no amount of denial or silencing can nullify that reality. And as a result, this tradition of text, self, and God invites to a different kind of existence that is true to who we really are. The alternative to these kinds of reductionisms that kill is a life lived in a risky relationship of fidelity. So I propose to sketch out this alternative God of fidelity in two texts that you know well that are an alternative to certitude. I believe that the prize text for this is in Hosea 2. It is that long poem that begins in angry, vigorous divorce proceedings. It's very patriarchal. I want you to know I know that. Between Yahweh and wife Israel. And when you read along in this bill of particulars, this angry husband God says, "Therefore I will hedge up her ways." And then in verse 9, this angry husband says, "Therefore I will take back my grain and my wine and my wool and my flax." And then when you read down to verse 14, you get a third therefore. Therefore, and we now know the duck. Except that it's a rhetorical trick. Therefore. And the third therefore is completely inexplicable. Therefore, I will allure her, and I will bring her into the wilderness, and I will speak tenderly to her, and I will turn her valley of trouble into a door of hope. And then the text goes on to have God take new wedding vows toward Israel. I will take you for my wife forever. I will take you for my wife in righteousness, justice, steadfast love, mercy, and faithfulness. These are the big 5 words of relationship: justice, righteousness, steadfast love, faithfulness, mercy. And if you know those, you got everything that wants to be said here. But it is such a mouthful. It is a mouthful that attests to a relationship that will be durable and generative and life-giving. And so these 5 markers not only mark God, but they mark the kind of life that is possible in the world. And all that is required from the other side, from Israel, is that you shall know me. You shall acknowledge me. You shall embrace me. You shall come to terms with me. You shall practice righteousness, justice, steadfast love, mercy, and faithfulness. So the performance of fidelity in freedom is not a robotic action. It cannot be predicted or controlled or managed. And it is for that reason that so much of the Old Testament, particularly the Psalms and Job, are preoccupied with critiquing God's fidelity. That never gets into the lectionary, but are preoccupied with critiquing God's fidelity in those times when God has been experienced as not faithful. A second text is this strange text in the 3rd lament of the book of Lamentations after the destruction of Jerusalem. And grieving Jerusalem, the poet says, "He, God, has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of shalom. Gone is my glory, and all that I had hoped for." Sounds like Gospel Saturday. And then the next verse, without explanation or comment, says, "But the poet can say, the Lord is my portion, and therefore I will hope in him, after he had said, my hope is gone. Israel acknowledges in its affirmations that fidelity is not a guarantee, that the divine agent is capable of abrupt, inexplicable reverses. So I mentioned the yet in Exodus 34, yet I will by no means clear the guilty. Or in Jeremiah 30, the poet goes on in God's behalf to say that Israel's wound is incurable and her hope is grievous and nobody cares and there's no healing. But then you get down to verse 16 and you get a therefore. And God completely reverses field and says, therefore, I will restore you to health. Now, it may not surprise you that the commentaries say that verses 16 and 17 are an addition. We'd rather it be an addition than to think that God changed God's mind in the middle of the oracle. Or in Jeremiah 4, verse 27, the whole land will be desolate. But then the second line of the verse says, yet I will not make a full end. That's a gloss, you know. Except that God wants to take back the first line of the text by a reassurance in the second line, and the commentaries basically skip over that line because it doesn't sound like the same God could have said the same thing. So in Exodus 34, the divine freedom upsets every anticipation of forgiveness. In Jeremiah 30, the divine freedom upsets the final verdict of death. In Jeremiah 4, the divine freedom upsets the promise of a full end. It characteristically upsets every settled conclusion. And what we tend to do is that we seek to empty the text of risk. So historical criticism is one long effort to explain things away because this couldn't all be rhetoric from the same voice. Or we seek to redefine the self away from such risk, imagining a world of self-sufficiency, or imagining a world of Promethean control or hopeless despair. We seek to flatten God to orthodoxy, largely by eliminating from purview the texts that tell us otherwise. So we end up with an empty text, a one-dimensional self, and a flattened tradition. But what we discover is that this effort at certitude requires two contradictions. It first of all requires that we contradict the biblical evidence that discloses this God. But second, this flattened text and empty self contradicts lived reality. Everybody knows that our lives are not lived according to the TV advocacies that constitute the liturgies of certitude. Everybody knows that the right beer or the right car or the right drug will not yield happiness, even if your happiness lasts 4 hours before you call a doctor. Everyone knows that the huge money on exhibit in professional sports is not a model for anything real. Everybody knows that the deep hunger and requirement for a well-lived life is a dialogic engagement in fidelity. It is for that reason that the Bible is a wonder and a vexation. It is a wonder because it attests a character who is fully involved with us in the crisis of fidelity. It is a vexation because it serves to expose our false hopes for certitude and leaves fidelity raw and undomesticated. The tradition of certitude only requires reiteration. And for that reason, the ideological arrangements of tribe, sect, nation, or party only need a mantra or a slogan. But the tradition of fidelity requires endless, risky interpretation because the relationship keeps shifting, so that the narrative and the oracle and the song keep making new sounds. And I propose for theological education that it requires 3 great acts of courage to carry on with this character and this text. First, that the tradition of fidelity requires courage to practice imagination, the capacity to hold worlds that are alternative to the ones that are in front of us. So Paul Ricoeur has said that Jesus' parables are models of such imagination, and it is no wonder after he told some of these bewitching parables that his disciples said, I wonder what he meant by that. The world of certitude does not much welcome imagination, so that every totalitarian regime is scared to death of artists and poets and novelists whose business is imagination. But the great promissory poems of the exile in 2nd Isaiah, in the New Covenant of Jeremiah, or the New Temple of Ezekiel are wondrous acts of imagination that simply long anticipated Martin when he said, I have a dream. Second, this tradition of fidelity requires courage to engage in dialogic transactions with others who are unlike us and who on the face of it are clearly wrong. So in contemporary practice, Emmanuel Levinas, with his recognition that it is the face of the other that changes our reading of the tradition. And in biblical tradition, I suppose we have no better example of this engagement than the encounter of Jesus with the Syro-Phoenician woman. Elizabeth's sister Fiorenza has noticed the hard preposition to this woman after Jesus said, Gentiles don't get any of these goodies, but she said. So Jesus, in this dialogic transaction, is instructed by the other to move out of his tribe in ways that he had not yet thought to do. And that incredible dialogic interruption on the part of the woman who instructed Jesus eventually leads to the capacity of the church to admit Gentiles as first-class citizens in the body of Christ. And third, this tradition of fidelity requires enough courage to engage in sustained contestation. Such contestation is an insistence that there are no final readings, because final readings always lead to final solutions. So the lament psalms that we basically screened out of church usage are raw contestations with God that are an anticipation of the importunate widow, that's what we call her in polite society, that Jesus used to talk about prayer as nagging God till you get justice. The tradition of certitude does not allow for any contestation because everything is settled. On all these counts, imagination, dialogue, contestation, the tradition of fidelity stands in profound tension with the tradition of certitude. The trajectory of certitude finally reduces everything to transactions about commodities. But the trajectory of fidelity knows that the true values of life are not commodities, they are relational transactions. It is relationality that guarantees newness and in the same moment, and in that moment sustains amid anxiety. The Old Testament is a wonder because it is a primary witness to fidelity. And it is for that same reason, it is a vexation because we always hope for closure. The adjudication of these matters is a core task for communities of faith. It is a primal agenda for liberal arts, and it is the primary task, I propose, of theological education.